Pam Bondi didn't just pause. She completely stalled right there under the bright lights, with millions of Americans watching and waiting for an answer she couldn't provide. It was one question tied to 3 federal programs, and the Attorney General of the United States couldn't explain what had been eliminated from her own budget proposal. In that instant, the atmosphere in the room changed. Confidence gave way to uncertainty. A carefully maintained image cracked, and it became obvious that something far larger was unfolding beneath the surface. As the silence stretched, Representative Grace Meng stepped forward, prepared and precise, carrying not just documents and data, but the voices of communities that have spent years fighting to be heard. She pointed out that the proposed budget would eliminate grant programs designed to prevent hate crimes before they happen. One of those programs, she explained, was the Community-Based Approaches to Advancing Justice initiative, which she personally authored and which was established in fiscal year 2022. That program funded local organizations working on the ground to increase hate crime reporting, provide resources in languages other than English, and strengthen trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. It was created as a direct response to the alarming rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans during the COVID-19 pandemic. Meng reminded the room of the tragedy in March 2021, when 6 women of Asian descent were murdered in Atlanta, Georgia. In response, Congress passed her hate crimes legislation just months later. With bipartisan support. For years, Meng said, her constituents have shared stories of fear and isolation. Community leaders and experts consistently told her that prosecution alone is not enough. Prevention matters. Funding education, outreach, and trust-building programs is one of the most effective ways to stop hate before it turns violent. She then revealed that she was holding a letter sent to Bondi in May, written by hate crime survivors and family members, urging the Department of Justice not to eliminate these critical grants. The letter, she explained, was signed by relatives of Emmett Till, James Byrd Jr., Matthew Shepard, and survivors of the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting. Meng requested unanimous consent to enter the letter into the official hearing record. The request was granted without objection, turning directly to Bondi. Meng emphasized that while she fully supports law enforcement and the fair prosecution of hate crimes, combating hate requires a broader approach. It means bringing together police, community leaders, and everyday citizens. These grant programs, she said, have helped communities do exactly that. Her question was direct and unavoidable. Why does the budget propose eliminating the 3 largest sources of DOJ funding for hate crime prevention? Bondi responded by asking Meng to list the programs again, apologizing and saying she had not yet seen the letter. She added that she would welcome the opportunity to work together on addressing hate crimes, not only within the Asian American community, but across all communities. Meng calmly replied that the letter had been sent on May 15 and assured her that she and her team would make sure it was received. The exchange left a lasting impression. It wasn't just about missing paperwork or forgotten programs. It was about whether prevention, community trust, and protection for vulnerable groups still have a place in the nation's justice. Priorities. Bondi explained that one of the programs being discussed was called the Community-Based Approaches to Advancing Justice initiative. In total, she said, 3 programs had been cut. One of them directly supported local law enforcement agencies, including departments like the NYPD, helping officers train for and properly respond to hate crimes at the community level. She then shifted to the numbers. There are roughly 5,800 active grants that pass through her office, she said. So far, 365 of those grants have been canceled, which she described as about 6% of the total. Bondi added that 13 of those grants had already been restored after people contacted her directly. She emphasized that if lawmakers reached out to her personally, she was willing to share her phone number and meet one-on-one to review specific cases. She said she was open to sitting down and seeing whether adjustments could be made. Bondi admitted she was not familiar with the 3 specific programs mentioned but repeated that she was willing to reconsider grants brought to her attention regardless of party affiliation. She said each case was being reviewed individually and stressed that law enforcement remained her top priority, especially when it comes to hate crimes. She referenced her career as a prosecutor, highlighting her long focus on violent crime, violence against women, and public safety. She ended by saying she looked forward to working together to find solutions. The response might have sounded cooperative on the surface, but it didn't calm the tension in the room. No one expected the hearing to unravel the way it did. What was supposed to be routine oversight quickly transformed into a confrontation between urgency and detachment, between real-world fear and administrative distance, between leadership and deflection. This was no longer about personality differences. It became a deeper conflict over who receives protection in America and who is left vulnerable. Grace Meng didn't hesitate. She spoke with clarity and purpose, not as someone chasing headlines, but as a representative who had spent years listening to families living in fear, parents afraid to let their children walk to school, workers afraid to commute, elders afraid to speak their own language in public. She spoke for those people, and she made one thing unmistakably clear: hate doesn't begin with violence. It grows quietly, long before the first attack. When warning signs are ignored and prevention efforts are stripped away. She reminded the chamber that the surge in anti-Asian hate during the pandemic was not theoretical and not exaggerated. It was real. People were assaulted on sidewalks. Elderly victims were shoved to the ground. Families were attacked in grocery stores. A man was slashed across the face on public transit. A woman was pushed down a flight of stairs. And in Atlanta, 6 women of Asian descent were murdered in a single night of unimaginable violence. These were not abstract statistics. They were human lives. Each number represented a person, a family, a community forever changed. Meng didn't need raised voices or dramatic gestures. The facts carried their own weight. And she made clear that this issue extended beyond any single community. She began naming victims whose cases shaped the nation's understanding of hate crimes, including Emmett Till and James Byrd Jr., reminding everyone that history has shown what happens when hate is ignored and prevention is treated as optional. The message was unmistakable. Cutting prevention programs doesn't reduce crime. It increases the risk that the next tragedy is already being written. Matthew Shepard, the victims of the Pittsburgh synagogue attack. When those names were spoken, the room changed. They weren't mentioned for drama. They were invoked as a warning. A reminder that hate never disappears on its own. It adapts, it spreads, it hides in new forms, and it requires constant effort to confront. That was the core of Meng's argument, and it was grounded in years of hard lessons the country has already paid for. The programs she defended were not symbolic gestures. They were laws she helped write with bipartisan support, created specifically to stop hate before it turns deadly. These initiatives weren't vague theories or political talking points. They were practical tools used in real communities every day. Grants that funded multilingual outreach so immigrants could report crimes without fear. Local hate crime reporting centers. Specialized training for police departments. Community workshops designed to rebuild trust between law enforcement and neighborhoods scarred by bias. Educational programs to counter lies and disinformation. Early intervention efforts meant to interrupt radicalization before it escalates into violence. None of this was controversial. These programs had backing from both parties. They were supported by police departments. They were endorsed by survivors. They were defended by families who had already buried loved ones because hate was allowed to grow unchecked. And yet, without public explanation, these programs were suddenly cut by the Department of Justice. That was why Meng pressed the issue. Not to shame anyone, not to score points, but because the public deserved a clear answer. She asked directly and plainly, why eliminate the 3 largest federal grants focused on hate crime prevention? She named the programs. She cited their purpose. She spoke calmly, without accusation, without theatrics. She asked for transparency. Bondi's response only deepened the concern. First came the pause, then the uncertainty, then the request for Meng to repeat the program names. She admitted she wasn't familiar with them. She said she hadn't yet reviewed the letter written by survivors and victims' families. Instead of addressing the core issue, she shifted to broad statistics. Only 6% of grants were cut. 13 had already been restored. Law enforcement remains my priority, the words floated without connection. They didn't answer the question. They didn't explain the decision. They sounded like placeholders, as if she were searching for stable ground and couldn't find it. Then came the moment that stunned the room. Bondi offered to share her personal cell phone number. As if a national strategy on hate crime prevention could be resolved through private conversations. As if families who lost children to bias-fueled violence should just call and sort it out individually. As if sweeping policy decisions could be undone through informal favors instead of public accountability. The offer wasn't compassion. It was avoidance. Because the real issue was never whether Bondi would meet with lawmakers. The real issue was why these programs were cut in the first place. And that question remained unanswered. What made the exchange even more striking was Meng's approach. She wasn't confrontational. She acknowledged Bondi's past work. She affirmed the importance of prosecuting hate crimes. She repeatedly emphasized cooperation. Her tone was respectful, steady, and professional. She wasn't performing for cameras. She was doing oversight. And that made the silence louder than any argument. She was there to protect. But every time her clarity met evasion, a larger question began to take shape in the room. One no one stated outright, yet everyone felt circling the conversation. Was this truly a bureaucratic oversight, or was something more deliberate driving these cuts? To be clear, no motive has been established as fact. But the absence of a clear explanation has opened the door to speculation across policy circles, advocacy groups, and online discussions. And none of those theories are reassuring. Some experts believe this reflects a broader shift within the department, of justice away from community-based prevention and toward a model focused almost exclusively on prosecution after harm has already occurred. Others suggest that certain political actors are uncomfortable with hate crime reporting initiatives because they expose patterns of bias and discrimination that challenge preferred narratives. There are even claims that some advisors view hate crime data as exaggerated and want to reduce programs that bring attention to those numbers. Again, none of this has been confirmed. But the fact that these questions exist at all highlights the real issue. The DOJ has not provided a transparent, coherent explanation. And when transparency disappears, rumors rush in to fill the void. That silence was exactly what Grace Meng was pushing back against, because the consequences are not abstract. When these grants disappear, communities lose vital resources. Police departments lose specialized training. Nonprofits lose the funding that allows them to translate materials, operate reporting hotlines, run workshops, and build trust with vulnerable populations. Survivors lose access to support systems. Families lose outreach tools. And hate crimes, already among the most underreported offenses in the country, become even harder to track. Without prevention, violence doesn't stop. It simply moves into the shadows for communities that already live with fear. Even a small funding cut sends a powerful message. You're on your own. Meng understood that reality, which is why her calm resolve stood in such sharp contrast to Bondi's uncertainty. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her record spoke for her. She reminded the chamber that these programs were created for a reason, because people were being attacked, because families were afraid, because ignoring hate has never made it disappear. It has only ever allowed it to grow. Then came one of the most revealing moments of the exchange. Meng explained that these programs weren't just about protecting targeted communities. They directly supported law enforcement. Major departments like the NYPD rely on these grants to train officers to properly identify, document, and investigate hate crimes. Cutting the funding doesn't just hurt communities, it weakens police departments themselves. And that's where the contradiction became impossible to ignore. If you defund training, how do officers respond effectively? If you cut prevention, how do you stop violence before it escalates? If you suppress reporting, how do you solve crimes at all? At that point, Bondi's talking points about prioritizing law enforcement began to collapse under their own weight, because you can't claim hate crime enforcement matters while dismantling the very tools that make enforcement possible. You can't say survivors matter. Then ignore their letter. You can't say prevention matters. Then cut prevention programs. It all comes back to one unavoidable truth. Actions reveal priorities, not words. And what the country witnessed in that hearing was a devastating mismatch. Between rhetoric and reality, this wasn't just a policy disagreement. It was a moral line in the sand. On one side stood communities begging to be heard, survivors pleading not to be forgotten, families who lost loved ones to hate, urging the government not to repeat history, law enforcement agencies asking for the tools and training they need to do their jobs, advocates pushing for programs proven to save lives. On the other side stood silence, confusion, and a cell phone number. That's why this hearing resonated far beyond Capitol Hill. It exposed something that rarely gets said out loud: the growing gap between what leaders claim to value and what their decisions actually protect. Hate doesn't need encouragement to grow. It thrives in the cracks left by inaction. It feeds on neglect. It multiplies when prevention disappears. And when a government quietly dismantles the very programs designed to stop that spread. The message is unmistakable, even if no one wants to say it plainly. Not all communities are being treated as equally worthy of protection. Grace Meng refused to accept that. Her determination transformed a routine oversight hearing into a moment of truth, one that revealed how thin the line can be between public safety and political convenience, one that showed why prevention matters just as much, if not more, than punishment, and one that reminded the country of something fundamental. Hate isn't defeated solely in courtrooms. It's prevented in classrooms. In community centers. Through language access. Through trust-building initiatives. Because once harm is done, justice can only go so far. Prevention is what saves lives. That's why Meng's final commitment landed with such force. She promised to flag every cut program, to follow up with every department, to keep pushing until real answers were given. She wasn't performing. She wasn't posturing. She was protecting, and that is exactly the kind of leadership this moment demanded. Now, the question falls to all of us. Should hate crime prevention programs ever be cut? If the government steps back, who steps in? If the DOJ won't protect these efforts, who will? And if silence replaces strategy, what happens next? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Hit like, subscribe, and stay engaged, because staying informed is the first step towards staying protected. And remember, silence isn't peace. Stay alert. Stay vocal. This fight is just getting started.